Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Santa Cruz Queer History webinars. This is our third webinar, and we are planning to do these webinars every Tuesday and Thursday through May and maybe through June. Just kind of depends how things are going. We are glad you're here. My name is Rob Darrow, and I will be the facilitator for this webinar. These webinars are co-sponsored by the Museum of Art and History and the Diversity Center of Santa Cruz County. We hope that when this pandemic is over, that you will visit the MA here in Santa Cruz and see the Santa Cruz Queer History exhibit in person. The exhibit will open online first on April 24th, and one of these webinars will probably talk about that as well. We are learning as we go with these webinars. We appreciate your feedback, and we appreciate you sharing your stories that could become one of our future webinars. Just a couple quick ground rules for our webinar here. If you have questions, please type them in the chat room, and I will ask those questions at whatever point there is in the future. It's easier for me to do that rather than each one of you to take the mic and that sort of thing, and it gives us more time to hear our speakers as well. If you want to hang out afterwards, we will stop the recording at that point, and you can just talk about whatever at that point. So again, thanks for being here. I wanted to point out a couple of important pieces overall here to know that Santa Cruz County queer history parallels the national LGBTQ history movement. People in Santa Cruz County have impacted the national LGBTQ rights movement and vice versa. There's been an exchange of people and ideas that have gone on from the 1970s up until now and into the future, I'm sure, as well. When UC Santa Cruz and Cabrillo College came to being in Santa Cruz in the 60s, that added more impact to the community as well. But you know, overall, Santa Cruz County has been an inclusive community for many, many years, thanks to many of the people you hear from today, but also just the general attitude of people in Santa Cruz. The other thing to know is in the 50s, we had the Lavender Scare. In the 50s and 60s, it caused LGBTQ organizations to develop, like the Mattachine Society in Los Angeles and the Daughters of Bolitas in San Francisco. In 1966, we had the Compton's Cafeteria riots in San Francisco and the Stonewall riots in 1969. Many people think that Stonewall was the beginning of the LGBTQ rights movement, but it really was not. Many things happened before that that built on that. And you can see that the first organized Santa Cruz group around LGBTQ rights started in 1974. And our first Santa Cruz Pride was in 75. And Pride in Santa Cruz has continued every year since then. As we think about the Santa Cruz AIDS Project, which is what we're going to be talking about today, for those who may not know, in 1981, this was the first article that was published. And the headline was "A Rare Cancer in 41 Homosexuals," and that was the first article. So that was 81. It talked about that some men had died and what different doctors were learning about. In 1982, the CDC named the illness AIDS, or acquired immune deficiency syndrome, and then it continued on from there. In 1982, from what I know, the first men in Santa Cruz passed away from AIDS. In 1983, Dr. Jerry Solomon, who's on this with us today, attended a conference in Denver, and then he came back and shared the information he learned with a group of men in the fall of 1983. Eventually, the Santa Cruz AIDS Project was established, and our early executive directors were Gerald Landers, Joe Kinney, and then John Laird, and many of them are here with us today. In the exhibit, when the exhibit's opens, you'll see some of these documents as part of the exhibit. I just wanted to share, here was an AIDS colloquium done by the Santa Cruz AIDS Project in 1986 that took place at Cabrillo College, and Patrick, that's where you're listed there as taking a drug abuse and sexual history. That's one of your workshops there. There was this early letter that is in the Santa Cruz MA archives that shows the people that were part of the AIDS Project and letters that went out to various organizations throughout Santa Cruz County about what was going on. In this particular letter, you can see from 1988 that the AIDS cases in Santa Cruz were quadrupling every year at this point in time. And then I just wanted to highlight this one article from 1989 that shows two of the founders of SCAP, Gerald Landers and Wesley Harris, and I'm sure some of the people on the call will talk about them as well. So with that, I'm going to let everybody know that our focus today is really the beginning of the AIDS epidemic in Santa Cruz, how people in Santa Cruz responded, and the early years of the Santa Cruz AIDS Project in 1980. Eventually, we'll do a webinar talking more about the AIDS quilt and some of the other things that went on related to AIDS and other stories that you may offer to share. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let you see all the other people here. And I'm going to start, I think I'll start with asking Jerry this first question, which is, what brought you to Santa Cruz and how did you get connected with the Santa Cruz AIDS Project? So Jerry, I'll have you start, and then Terry, you'll be next. And let's see. Jerry, we need you to unmute.
I finished graduate school in 1975 and moved up to Santa Cruz in 1976, basically to hang out with a friend of mine, Iowa Gold, who was at that time working for the counseling center, the Santa Cruz Community Counseling Center. And so I started there in a half-time position, and in a year was the director of the outpatient component of the counseling center. And during that period, of course, AIDS wasn't happening. And what I was focused on predominantly was trying to increase a gay presence, start gay counseling. When I moved up, I was the only identified gay counselor in a tri-county area, which was a difficult situation for me and for the rest of the community. So I was quite committed on trying to form peer counseling activities and other activities that would promote community for gay and lesbian folks. And I'll come back and talk about AIDS after some of the other folks do. So I'll stop right here, Rob.
Great. Terry? If you're talking, Terry, we need you to unmute.
Unmute.
Okay, how's that?
Much better.
All right, thank you. I moved to Santa Cruz about 1981. I'm not certain of the year because I don't track years as much as I do events and experiences and feelings, but it was somewhere about then. I had been living in San Francisco for a while. I'd been living in Berkeley. I'd been living in Bolinas, California. And I had a friend that was at UC Santa Cruz and graduated, and I needed to change. I came to Santa Cruz. I really liked it. I'd come for visits. I thought it was a really great place. It was a good shift for me. I had found San Francisco to be a little too intense back then. It was the site of all this intensive gay liberation and freedom, but it also was really kind of a very pounding, grinding, intense place for a young gay man. And I just needed something that was a little more quieter and a little more calmer and a little more to my speed. And I didn't get involved in the AIDS project until considerably later, but I did find that there was a welcoming and supportive gay community here. I stayed there for 30 years. I'm currently living in Portland, Oregon, and I moved from Santa Cruz to Portland here about 5 years ago. But I spent over 30 years living in Santa Cruz, the longest place that I've ever lived in any community in my life. I still have a home there and lots of friends and family and connections, and I come there regularly, and I'm looking forward to coming back after this COVID pandemic calms down. And I'll also stop there and let somebody else have a chance to introduce themselves.
Great. Joe? Unmute yourself, please.
I did it too. I moved to Santa Cruz in 1974. I had a relationship breaking up, and a friend of mine had her sister living in a small town named Davenport on the California coast. So we hopped on a Greyhound bus and took it through the south and landed at the bus station and walked up Pacific Avenue and met at this place called Bookshop Santa Cruz. And what was amazing to me is that I was coming from Brooklyn, New York, and we got in the back of a pickup truck and we're driving up the coast, and I thought I had died and gone to heaven. Like, people really live here? This is amazing. And my introduction to the AIDS community was, I was on the Public Health Commission for the county, Gary Patton's representative, in 1981. I was a volunteer with the Santa Cruz Women's Health Collective, and I got a subscription to Gay Community News, and they were the only ones that were really tracking AIDS. And I brought it in every month to the public health officer, who was, help me out here, guys. I had it in my head and it just went out. Anyway,
George Wolf?
Yes, George Wolf. And I'd be like, George, do you have any idea how many gay men live here? Do you have any idea how many gay men visit here from San Francisco? We've got a problem. We've got a problem. So that was just a peripheral thing. And I went to some of the education pieces, and Jerry recruited me to help on marketing and advertising for one of the conferences that they were having. And that was probably 85, I think. And I worked in nonprofits and came on as executive director in 88, 87, 88.
Great.
Thank you.
John, you want to share your beginning story here?
Sure. I came to Santa Cruz in 1968. I was in the 4th full class at UCSC, graduated in 72, went away for 2 years, came screaming back, worked for the county administrative officer and was the analyst for health. So I was involved in all the health issues and was the analyst for community programs. That's how I first met Jerry, because I had community counseling and everybody else in my portfolio. And I was active in politics, was sort of slow to be active in the gay community, but that seems kind of funny because it's 40 years ago now. And, you know, my first things were to go to Gay Pride, and there was an organization called CUDB, Community United to Defeat the Briggs Initiative. That was in, I think, 1978, and I went to things for that and did things. And then Jerry and I helped organize a demonstration against the city of Capitola that had arrested gay men in undercover operations in the beach area. That ended up with over 200 people going down to a city council meeting. Jerry and I having a 2-hour meeting with the Capitola police chief, in which Jerry and I were allowed to speak for about 5 minutes of it. And then was elected to the city council in 1981 and introduced a resolution about HIV that was already called AIDS in the spring of 1983 at the city, about more funding for education and services, and was just involved in lots of other ways that will come up in the rest of this conversation. So I'll just stop there.
Great. Lark?
I'm unmuting here.
Sounds good.
Hi, I'm Lark Letchworth. I moved to Santa Cruz April 1st, 1984. I had lived a year and a half up in the Guerneville Russian River area. Am I unmuted?
Yep, you're sounding good.
Okay. So yeah, 84. I had taken like a year and a half from my career with UC and spent that in the Russian River area. I was working for one of the gay resorts, doing the front desk and checking in the guests arriving, many of them men with the signs of this new gay cancer, trying to figure out what the heck was going on, not getting much news coverage about this new disease, and quickly decided I just needed to get out from under the trees, get out into the world and do something, starting by educating myself, and told my housemate, soulmate, Dennis Walsh, many of us know him as the Pineapple Princess, I'm moving to Santa Cruz, and he decided to make that move with me. And I kind of hit the ground running, volunteering with SCAP. I just kind of showed up and said, don't know what I have to offer, but here I am. And it was about the time there were trainings starting for practical support volunteers. There was a separate training called emotional support volunteers, who later became the buddy system for SCAP. And the two kind of merged. I did that for a year or so, and then also became a street outreach worker doing education and prevention. And my focus was mostly in the Cruz areas, where I'd go out and interact with the men who were cruising at the beach, or what was the rest stop called? Scenic. Anyway, doing the field outreach and education in terms of prevention.
Great, thank you. Patrick, you want to talk about what brought you to Santa Cruz? And...
My mom and dad. I was 6 weeks old when I first came, and the story is that as a baby, they said, you can't move the baby from one town to another because because the babies couldn't stand the change in water. Who knows? But my family had a cottage in Seabright that had been in the family for 2 generations, and it's where we spent our summers. Actually, from Easter through Thanksgiving, it was open, and we would come down a lot. I came back to Santa Cruz in 1977 in a Volkswagen camper van after going across country and kind of coming out gradually, and again lived in that house. I went away again let me back up. And I worked at Bookshop Santa Cruz, so I was kind of right in the middle of ground zero for Santa Cruz for a while there. Took over for Mark Small, who had gone to Bali, did the gay section, among other things. I went to graduate school at Boston University in 1983 and came back in 85. And almost immediately got swept into the burgeoning AIDS project as a mental health professional. I got my master's in social work from BU, and somehow I got roped into chairing the mental health professionals group, and out of that we developed really the trainings and so forth with the help of hospice. For the emotional support and the practical support folks that Lark was talking about. And I'll go on from there later in the discussion.
How do I put my name on it?
Jerry, would you like to talk about the early 80s and what kind of moved us in this direction?
Sure, I'd be more than glad to. So by 1980, I was pretty much trying to keep track of what was going on in the great gay movement in the United States. And in 1982, Larry Creamer formed the Gay Men's Health Crisis in New York City, and also put out the New York Native, and began to participate in one of the gay newspapers that was had large circulation. And in 1982, the New York Native had its first article about gay cancer, which we now call Kaposi sarcoma. In 1983, Larry Creamer left to form ACT UP because there was such a poor response from New York City in regards to the AIDS epidemic and people getting sick and dying on the streets with no action from the mayor, Ed Koch, at the time. So reading this, and also I had already attended 2 people's deaths related to AIDS and had patients that I was working with who had AIDS. I decided to go to the 2nd Annual AIDS Forum in Denver, Colorado in 1983, which was sponsored by the Center for Disease Control. And there were around 4,000 people who attended. And most interesting, 700 of them were people with AIDS, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. But when I went there, the epidemiologists present those presented those epidemiological graphs that we're all seeing these days with COVID, showing the rapid and steep rise of AIDS cases at that point. In 1983, there were less than 800 AIDS deaths in the whole country. But we already had enough information to know who the high-risk groups were: gay and bisexual men, IV drug users, and in those times, Haitians, because that was one of the routes of transmission from Haiti into the United States. So we knew what the routes of transmission were. We knew that we had concerns for the blood bank, and there were strong recommendations going around about closing the gay men's bathhouses to try to stop transmission. Interestingly, at that point, Bobby Campbell, who was a gentleman from New York who had AIDS, organized the early activists, and at that conference, took over a plenary session at the end and demanded that CDC change their language. They were calling people who had AIDS, they were calling them AIDS victims back then. And they insisted that they not be called AIDS victims, but rather people with AIDS. They demanded that that be changed, and they demanded that people with AIDS sit at the table and make policy decisions with the physicians. This was a radical shift from anything that had happened up until that point. I left that conference quite moved, and I took 5 days off additionally and drove through Rocky Mountains and Estes Park and sat down to try to make a decision what I was going to do with this information. And at that point, I dedicated myself to fight the AIDS epidemic and to create structures at home that would try to keep my friends alive and the community healthy. So I sat down for 5 days and journaled and generated an image of a project that I ultimately in my own head called the Santa Cruz AIDS Project, designed the public education component, some of the other elements, began to brainstorm who should be on the board of directors, and then came home and in the summer of '83 and spoke to George Wolf, who was the medical director of Santa Cruz County at the time, told him what I had learned and asked whether the county would sponsor an AIDS community meeting under the rubric of public health crisis rather than a gay men's crisis. And George agreed. And in early fall, I think it was October of '83, the county convened a large meeting for gay men in Santa Cruz County. There were around 150 men who attended. And I stood up alone on that stage and shared the information I had learned in Denver and did my first safe sex demonstration with condoms in front of men during that time also. Most importantly, I had learned very early that this gay cancer was too scary and it seemed too removed. So I realized to make an impact in the community, I really needed a human face on the issue. At that time, I was seeing in my practice a gentleman named Gary Ruckholtz, who was fairly well known in the community, an entertainer, had a wonderful voice, he would always light up a room when he came in. He was quite progressed with AIDS at that point in time, and I asked him whether he'd be willing to disclose that he had AIDS and share what it was like to be a person with AIDS in 1983, which he did. He was very frightened and concerned that he would be discriminated against. However, true to course with everything else at Santa Cruz, the community embraced him. I think he cried for days after that with the acceptance that he received. And there was a softening in the community about AIDS, and that tone continued from that point forward. By 1983, a very good friend of mine, Sam Singer, who was a physician working in the Students' Health Center at UCSC and was a biology instructor at UCSC, was failing. And in 1985, he died of AIDS. By 1984, I was receiving 10 to 15 phone calls a day in my practice from the worried well, wanting to know what to do and how to protect themselves from AIDS. Back then, we talked about the worried well as people who didn't know whether they were at risk or not because we had no tests to find out who was positive. And so everyone was sitting on tenterhooks, not sure what to do and not sure how to avoid infection. By the end of 1984, I was getting so many requests that I realized it was time to form an organization. And I convened a meeting in the end of 1984, the gay and lesbian community presented the issues and asked whether they would be willing to support forming a 501c3 nonprofit to deal with the issues of AIDS, which the community did agree. And then we went forward at that point to start forming Santa Cruz AIDS Project. I'd like to share something with you. So, can you see this?
Yep.
This is me in 1983 as I was trying to go about and form the AIDS Project. And the very first person who came forward, was Gerald Landers. Gerald Landers and his partner, Wesley Harris, were living in San Jose and moved over in 1982. Both ended up being HIV positive. Gerald was working in Dominican Hospital as an administrator. And when the Santa Cruz AIDS Project was formed, Gerald quit his job and worked as a volunteer for SCAP for around 8 months until we got our first initial funding to pay his salary as executive director. He got paid for half time. He worked time and a half for sure. He worked at least 60 hours a week in the beginning. Very, very hard. Gerald again, and again, Gerald. And one more. So I think I'm going to stop here and take a pause here and talk and hear other people talk about how they responded to that initial meeting and how they began to participate with SCAP.
Great. I was wondering who else, Terry, I know you were at that first meeting that Jerry came back from. Do you remember anything from it? Or John or anybody else?
Well, I do remember the total frightening nature of this epidemic at that time. The not being able to get tested was very difficult for people who, you know, again, the word worried well was expressed, but actually on a personal note, I mean, I spent 2 years absolutely terrified and rather convinced that I probably was an infected person. I was 27 years old. I'd lived in San Francisco. I had many, many friends and lovers who I'd been intimate and sexual with who either had AIDS or died of AIDS already. And one of the most pronounced things I remember from that meeting is clarifying the nature of this disease was viral, and you know, a virus was like a cold, is how a lot of us understood it. And the idea of not sharing bodily fluids was the first thing that really hit me. You mean, and I think I might have been one of the persons that clarified the question, maybe a number of us did. When you say don't share bodily fluids, you mean like don't kiss anyone on the lips? Is that what you're saying? And I remember the affirmation that that's exactly what was being suggested at that time. And I kind of rolled my eyes in the back of my head and thought, oh, I've done a lot more than that with a lot of different people. And I don't know how I'm ever going to get out of this, because if that's all it takes to get infected, it's, you know, it's going to be pretty difficult. And I will say that my introduction to the AIDS Project didn't come directly until I was able to overcome my initial terror. And that is the word that I lived under for a couple of years until I could finally get testing, until the testing was available. And I felt brave enough and comfortable enough to actually find out my actual antibody status. And once I did that and tested negative, it was a kind of a reborn experience. And then I was able to join and get engaged in the AIDS Project at that time. But prior to that, I was standing by, listening, watching, evaluating. I do remember having an experience. I was living with David Thomas, who was the professor of politics up at UC Santa Cruz, one of the first people in the country to ever teach openly a gay politics course. We were housemates, and he used to get periodicals from all over the country, including the New York Native. And I remember standing at the door one time, picking up the mail and looking at the front cover of the famous New York Native issue that said something like 1078 and counting, all in gigantic type. And that was a wake-up call for me. And it was a huge amount of psychological, emotional, behavioral adjustment before a lot of us could even begin to engage productively in the epidemic. And at least that was my introduction to those early meetings and that early experience of just the terror.
John or Patrick or anybody else, were you at that first meeting?
Well, it's 37 years ago, so some of this all runs together in
Sure.
certain ways. And I have a recollection of a community meeting that we were all instrumental of that was at Loudon Nelson. That was, I think we broke into working groups. It was broader than just the gay community, because I remember George Wolf and Betsy McCarty were there from the health department. And it seemed like out of that meeting came the impetus for the AIDS project. And it was, as Jerry said, there was a question about whether you think this is valuable. And people said yes, but then there were 6 of us that stepped up to be on the board. And I saw Jerry had some pictures of some of the additional ones. And the interesting thing is that Jerry and I and Wesley and Gerald and then Sean Wharton and Ray Martinez. And it was always interesting, given the discussion, that it was somehow white gay men that stepped up. That was 3 white gay men and 3 gay men of color that were among the 6 that sort of were original. And now that I finally have access to the Sentinel's library online, I have a vague recollection that there was actually discussion in a story in the Sentinel about whether to form this. And I remember I was either on the city council or mayor at the time, and I remember being quoted as saying, I'd be open to working on that. And so that exists in some story somewhere, because this sort of played out in public as well. And it is hard to overstate some of the things that Terry just said about the level of fear and unknown about what was going on. We actually, at the city level, adopted an ordinance that was non-discrimination on the basis of HIV, because somebody that was volunteering early on at the AIDS project was told at work, you have to stop volunteering or we'll fire you. And then they fired her. And so we actually adopted that at the city level because there was that level of fear. There was that lack of knowledge. And as much as we look back at the fact that this incredible organizing effort happened and it was community-based and it was really good, it was in a climate, I think when we were in that first meeting that involved the health department, the fact that they were participating, we thought was just this incredible breakthrough, because somehow they were mainstream and we weren't. And so there were lots of different things, and I know we'll get to further discussion on all this, but it was, as we moved into it a little, the women that really stepped up, and I'm sure others will speak to that, but there was that whole climate and that first organizing effort with everyone.
Why don't you talk about the beginning conversation? So the beginning conversation was that broader meeting, and then that's how a smaller group came out of that to form the AIDS project?
That's my recollection, because it was a smaller group of 6 of us on the board, and it was a broader community meeting. And I mentioned offline earlier that I found these agendas from 1987, and what happened is I think we went a first year or some period of time with the 6 of us, and then we added 10 people and broadened the base of the board out into the community, so that it included, Ken Koenig, who was head of the mental health at Dominican. It included a lot of different people that sort of came on after that first blush, and I don't want to everybody has something to say, but Sean went to the Shanti training, and so he became the person that took the first clients. And then the reason we had to have some kind of client services is Sean couldn't do more than 2 or 3 at a time after he learned the training up in San Francisco to do the practical support. And Terry came on, I think maybe Gerald was on as executive director first, but Terry was the first actual paid staff member because we got this grant from the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And I was very embarrassed that I lobbied for it. I was a mayor at the time, but Santa Cruz didn't belong to the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And so we helped get this grant, and we weren't even members of the organization.
Jerry, are there any other stories about the very beginning of the AIDS project that stick out in your mind?
Well, yeah, so, I mean, there's so much to talk about. The first 6 or 8 months, we had no site. We met at my office on board meetings, and what I want to honor is the county. I think John Laird was talking about. The county stepped forward very, very rapidly. In other communities, this was identified as a gay illness, and county public health wanted nothing to do with it. In Santa Cruz, that was absolutely not the situation. And George Wolf stepped on very, very early, and then gave us a small grant. I think it was $10,000 so that we could rent a small office on Santa Cruz Avenue in Aptos. And it was a 2-room, tiny little place, but finally we had a place to be, and that was very, very powerful. The other thing that was also powerful, and John alluded to that too, was the emergence of women in the community coming forward to be helpful. And for those who are younger and don't remember, in the late 70s and early 80s, the men and women's community were quite separate. And women were quite active in doing lesbian separatism was very much what was happening in the late 70s and early 80s. Women's music festivals and all sorts of activities were happening. Men were in discos, women were organizing major events at the time. And never the twain shall meet. There was a huge divide in the community. And so it was very heartening to me when Santa Cruz AIDS Project started that women began to surface from the community. Laura Geigus was one of the very first, and Robin Roberts came forward and said, we'll do anything you want us to do. And then Joe Kenny came forward, and then a whole group of women came forward. And for the first time in our meetings, men and women were sitting together again, solving problems. And it was a really heartening event, and that really stood out very dramatically for me.
Great. Joe, you want to add on to that and talk a little bit about how you came on board and your involvement prior to being executive director? Can you unmute you, Joe?
Sorry. My career was in nonprofits, and I had a background in management and volunteer coordination and grant writing. So when the job opened up, when Gerald decided that he was going to step down, I think he'd been there about a year and a half. I applied for it and got the job. I was the first lesbian in California to run an AIDS organization. I think I was the first woman. I don't remember exactly. What I do remember was there being, I didn't know at the time that there was tension among some of the community members, the gay men community members, and the and clients about, they were nervous about whether I could represent the organization appropriately and really talk about what the emotional and practical needs were for people with AIDS. And I remember I did an interview, and Jim Schultz came up to me afterwards and said, okay, we were nervous, but now we're proud you're here. So I finally got the acceptance that I didn't know I didn't have in the beginning. Oh, there's a picture of Terry. So it was, in the beginning, it was Terry and I and this halftime reception person, and everyone else was a volunteer. And there were hundreds of volunteers, and there was never a sense that there were more men than women. And, you know, each client, each person who came in had different needs, and oftentimes there were more than one buddy for a person because they had so many different things, and we became their family.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the buddy system that you established? And then I know that Lark talked about that. It'll be interesting to hear what he has to say after you kind of talk about how you moved into that direction or the programs that were developed.
Well, like I said, when I came in, it was really clear we would never have enough staff to take on everyone who was coming forward. I think, you know, Terry, you might remember, I think that the number was 27 when I first came on, that we had active clients that we were working with. It grew really fast after that. And there was a very well-organized buddy system and for emotional and practical help for people living with AIDS. There was a well-developed volunteer system for people who were doing education, like what Lark was talking about, and school-based education. You know, we were very, very well organized. And I remember the community stepped up so well so that every time we wanted to celebrate the volunteers, we literally had to break them up into different groups. So there was the buddy system and the education and outreach workers. Because there were so many of them, we couldn't hold an event in one facility. And a lot of restaurants would host events for the volunteers for free. And we worked really hard to thank people because that was the backbone of the organization. I remember when the earthquake happened, our system was so well together that everyone who was a volunteer buddy went home, took care of their home life, and then in the same day checked in with their client. And every single client was okay. Nobody got hurt, except one person who was actually in the hospital at what used to be County Hospital down the block from our then office, and the window broke. And he was the only person who was actually in the hospital at the time who got slightly hurt from the earthquake. But the system held really, really well. The trainings were very, very intense, and people stayed there. They stayed for years. Would move from one, you know, if they got kind of burnt out on being a buddy, people would go to being educators, and they served an incredible purpose in the community. And I think the education that happened really helped lower the numbers that we had. It could have been so much worse.
Can I chime in for 1 second here? Is it okay if I just want you to know I was the buddy visiting my patient, my client at community hospital during the earthquake when he was in his hospital bed, and I was at his bedside when the earthquake of '89 hit.
Wow.
I was the
Oh, Larry.
Thanks, Larry.
Yep.
Thank you.
Lark, you want to talk a little bit about the training you went through to become a buddy, or what that was like, and a little bit about that early process?
Remember initially was when I showed up for my first training, how disappointed I was that so few of us. It seemed like, from what I remember, it seems like that initial training, there were less than a dozen. And it just seemed like it, I guess my expectations were higher. That was the initial thing I remember. The trainings were very valuable to me because I think I said this already, but my first response to gay cancer grid was, oh, I need to educate myself. And so I found that resource through SCAP, through the beginnings of SCAP. I still have a few of these little pamphlets. This one, the sisters in San Francisco had put together early on. This was the San Francisco AIDS Foundation. We used these at the beginning of our education efforts before we developed our own. I noticed this one from the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgences dated 1982. That's how far back that goes. But yeah, the trainings were very valuable, and it wasn't long before, as Joe said, there was a wonderful, huge response from the community. And it was teamwork, and we were all just figuring out our own little places and how we could be there and what kind of skills we could provide.
Great.
I also have some photographs here from one of the early SCAP volunteer parties. Here's Jo with her full head of hair, dark hair, along with Dennis Walsh. And here's another shot. In the middle there is Sterling Malloy, who was my first SCAP client.
Great, thanks for sharing those.
I could add a little bit, if I might, a little bit of the details of the actual volunteer program.
Do you want to do that, and then we'll have Patrick talk about the training pieces?
I'll do it briefly as I can.
Go for it.
I was the director of volunteers. So it was my one job at the Santa Cruz AIDS Project, which I did for 4 years. I oriented approximately 1,000 people from the community during volunteer coordination orientations, which happened for 2 hours every other week or twice a month. I often had 30 people, anywhere from 20 to 35, 40 people in the room every 2 weeks. Half of those people came to the orientation. Half of the orientation was the safety issue about HIV, how you could get it and not get it. Half the people in the room signed up to possibly be a volunteer, but I never heard from them again, which was perfectly fine because we really could not handle that volume of volunteers. That's how rich the experience was and the response was to the epidemic in Santa Cruz. But that left the other half still available. That meant we had approximately 500 volunteers working with us over the 4-year period that I was there for the volunteer director. So, when Lark mentions that we had small groups for the buddies, that's true, but we had the buddies, the practical support, the education volunteers, the group that went out to do fundraising, the people who spoke because they were HIV positive as a first-hander, the people who just did regular education. We had the mental health team. Eventually, we got interns from graduate programs who would come and do their work with us. One person set up a PAWS program, Pets Are Wonderful Support, to mimic what we had done in San Francisco. We had a massage practitioner program where we had people who would come in and offer to do massages for clients. So clients would get that sometimes twice a month. I mean, again, talking about the fear, I remember a volunteer coming in one time who was a massage practitioner. She was at the volunteer orientation and she said to me right in the middle, "But do I have to touch the person with AIDS?" And I kind of stopped and scratched my head and thought, I'm not really sure how you do massage without touching somebody. And I said, well, you could wear gloves. That would be up to you. But that is generally how massage is done. And that's the nature of it. And it was just an indication of how frightened people were. Yeah. That person, as odd as that question was, eventually overcame their fear and became one of the best massage practitioners that we had.
Those are great. Patrick, you want to add on to that?
Oh, I have to say, thank you, Terry, because you really highlight just how complex the whole program or the project was. There were many, many, many people involved in a variety of different services. Just to back up a little bit about the women's involvement, the other place where women were involved with men in our community and stepped out of that separatist kind of piece that was going on was with the Briggs Initiative. And I think that working on that together established a template, if you will, a way of working together. But moving forward, I was chairing the mental health professionals team. We were talking about what were the needs of the volunteers, and through hospice's support, we set up a training at the hospice building, which was a house over by Cabrillo, and we would do weekend-long trainings, and they were very intense. They were modeled somewhat after the Shanti Project, but definitely after the hospice training program for hospice volunteers. And it involved an education component. but it also involved a lot of work with death and dying, and helping people prepare for the kind of work that they would be doing, and to talk about some of their own fears and so forth as well. After the initial volunteer group started working together, we had these once a month support meetings where the smaller groups would actually meet with a mental health professional that, and it was a support group. So for instance, I had a practical support group, and they were people that were providing practical support, but we also had a chance to really process our feelings about what was going on with our clients. And when a client died, you know, we would spend a lot of time just helping the person who had lost that person, you know, move through some of their feelings with that. There was also the whole mental health component where we had mental health professionals providing a support group for people with AIDS, and actually Sally Blumenthal and I conducted the first family and friends support group just on the back side of that building on Santa Cruz Avenue. There was a A-frame that's still there, and that was quite an experience. We were not sure what was going to happen and who was going to show up. But we had a number of parents. We had parents who were just angry as hell about their son, becoming sicker and sicker. A lot of friends that were also afraid that if they got too close, that they might catch it. But to go back to the practical support group, for instance, and there was buddy support groups as well. One of the groups that I worked with there, we met for like 10 years, you know? So it was more than just talking about our clients, it was about our lives and how we were growing and changing as well. It was quite something.
Great. Who's that, Jerry?
Sally Blumenthal McGannon.
Oh, great. If anybody has her contact info, I'd love to have it. Anyway, I think by way of I know there's lots we could talk about, and we hope to do another webinar specifically around the AIDS project in Santa Cruz and the AIDS outreach of Santa Cruz. But as a way of closing out here, I'd like to invite each one of you to talk about, you know, what did you take away from those years working in SCAP or the organizing, or what are some of the key takeaways that are important that you want to share with future generations? And I'm going to start with Jerry on that question and then go through, then I'll go to Terry, Joe, John, Lark, and then Patrick, you'll have the final word on that. So any final thoughts, reflections on that time and what it was like for you, Jerry?
Absolutely. Okay. Well, so I thought about this, and probably what was most dramatic for me is the arc, the sociologic arc that occurred during this era. Here we were just finishing the Vietnam War, petrified as men that we were going to get drafted. Gay rights began to appear across the United States. Gay men moved into the disco era. Gay liberation was up. I can't express how exciting and dramatic a time this was. And then we encountered this terrible, terrible situation that changed everything almost overnight and had most of the community dealing with multiple loss and paralyzed with grief. And for me, what was most interesting as a result of that is that we moved into spirituality and a quest for meaning as a community because we had to, given what we were facing. And we refused to accept the heteronormative narrative that we were defective and broken. And as a result of the AIDS epidemic, we generated a new narrative, and it's a narrative of resilience and pride. And it's been very exciting participating through that arc through the years.
Great. Terry?
You know, I always have a couple of takeaways about how important the epidemic was in impacting my life. one of the things I realized at a certain point is that I might have fared much better than some people because of the way that I went kind of head on into the epidemic. As I said earlier, once I tested negative, I went immediately and got involved as a volunteer at the AIDS Project, and then I got hired and was stepping into it deeply. And it was really beneficial for me. I think it helped me remain more courageous for the rest of my life. And I think I was able to process and be present and be awake and conscious through all of the growth that Jerry just highlighted about the search for meaning and a sense of spirituality, interconnectedness, the sense of development of who we were as a people. I got the privilege of being able to act on those values. And the other is really sounds simplistic, but it's also profound, which is I got a permanent respect for every day because I met so many people and worked with so many people in which the days were limited that they had. They had a month left, a year left. They didn't know how many days they had left or how many months they had left. Some of them lived a long time, but a lot of them did not. And I got a very profound appreciation for the be here now experience of there's no guarantees of tomorrow and be present. And that can sound very new agey, but I actually have the privilege of living that every day. There aren't really problems that overwhelm me in the way that I see people get overwhelmed because of the strength that I was able to forge in the experience of that epidemic. So I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Joe. Unmute.
What you both said just is so, it's so real. I was thinking that I became fearless, and I learned that genuineness is so important, and people speaking for themselves. So when a number of years later, 95, Gloria and I moved to New Mexico, and I got the chance to run a statewide LGBT organization, and we were fighting for civil rights. And one of the principles, the underlying principles, was that we didn't speak for everyone, particularly since we were from out of state. And we organized to have people from these small pueblos and communities, rural communities all over the state, learn how to do advocacy and come to the state capitol and speak for themselves. And that I learned at SCAP. You know, sorry, there's still a lot of emotion there, and I'm not afraid of that anymore.
Thanks, Joe.
That's what I took away.
John?
Well, you know, I think everyone has said it so well, and I might say in a slightly more personal way, one of the things that Jerry said, which is that I think, you know, it's hard to remember when there was a time before HIV, but when there was a lot of narcissism and a lot of things that went on, and going through the crisis was such that we had to look into it. We had to face it. We had to be mature. And I think one of the reasons there might be resiliency, or one of the reasons that the barriers broke down between men and women in a lot of ways, is that we had to face reality in that way, and we had to deal with it. But I had this one experience that just sort of told me it's never far away, and that was I was in the state legislature, and I was invited by this young gay guy. He was at Sacramento City College, and he says, you know, we're doing a benefit fundraiser for the debate club, and we're doing readings from Howard Zinn. Would you come and do a reading? And I thought, sure, you know, and I agree, and he gives me a choice, and there is Vito Rousseau wrote this article on why we fight, and he had been in Santa Cruz. He wrote The Celluloid Closet, amazing guy who died, and he wrote this article, and in the middle of it, because it was called Why We Fight. The New York Times does an editorial in the mid-'80s or sometime in there saying, don't worry, it hasn't gotten to the mainstream yet. And he just wrote really defiantly, well, who are we, chopped liver? And really took them on. So I read this thing, and there's a crowd of about 200 people, and I get about a third of the way into it, and I can barely continue. My voice cracks. I'm struggling to get every word out. And it didn't even happen at my dad's memorial. I mean, it really was powerful. And they gave me an ovation for about 2 minutes afterwards. And I was like, geez, I just stuck something in my arm and bled all over. You leave me alone. But what it really said is that time is never far away. And the people that we lost there are never far away, and that we think about them all the time. And that just was, in the moment, brought it forward in a way that I'm sure happens with all of us, that we're talking about this as if it's ancient history, but some of the people from that time and that place are there with us every day. And that is just one of the big takeaways.
Thanks, John. Mark?
You know what I'm left with, for me, one of the biggest blessings of the Santa Cruz AIDS Project, not only the support that it provided clients and friends of clients, but also that the education, the messaging, and the visibility of LGBTQ people in the world. One of the bigger educational pieces for me was the way we do prevention is to build community. It's about connecting, it's about connection. It's about bringing people together. And, you know, from there we went to, community center. Let's talk about building a community center in Santa Cruz that gets the LGBTQ folks out of the bars and connecting and talking together. And it was like the next year that we were doing fundraising simultaneously for SCAP and for this vision of a community center. And shout out to Marty Brown, who there every weekend, she and I were doing those rummage sales at the drive-in, and then we moved to the parking lot when SCAP moved to SoCal Avenue. There we were, right on the direct path to the drive-in where the flea market was happening every weekend, and folks were stopping by the SCAP parking lot first, and we were collecting money to make these dreams happen and to provide services. And so that's a big takeaway for me, is just building community and connecting.
Thanks. Patrick? You're on mute.
Am I?
Now you're good. You're back on mute.
There we go. It's a tough act to follow, you guys. I remember at one point in the midst of it all, telling somebody who from out of town who didn't really understand why any of us would be doing this, it's like, you know, it's what you do. It's what you do. These are my friends, my community. And I can also remember telling them, I never thought at this point in my life I would be dealing with death and dying. But it's what we did. It was initially terrifying. It was awful. So many people were dying. And that's a hard thing to communicate to people. I don't think you can understand, maybe now, but the other side, and because of that, so many people dying, it really forced you to look at many existential issues, very profound. You know, why are we here? What are we doing? As Terry said, you know, treasure every moment. So there were gifts that came out of that. There was so much support, and that was so nice to have during such a critical time. And I guess another gift for me was that out of it, I started teaching, and I'm still teaching at college level now from that. Yeah. So many gifts.
Great, thank you. So just to close this out for everybody, oh, that's not what I wanted to do, sorry. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing and just end up this way. So our webinars continue to move forward. As you heard, this was part of Santa Cruz, and Santa Cruz continues to move on in a variety of different ways. And we appreciate all the feedback and input that all of you shared with us today. And we look forward to other people being part of other stories in the future. So with that, I'm going to stop the recording. Thank everybody for being here. And then those of you who want to hang out longer and talk or chat or catch up, you're welcome to do